Well, good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Captain Michael Manfield. This evening we commemorate the 77th anniversary of the loss of the Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth and more than 350 members of her crew in the Battle of Sunda Strait on this date in 1942. The bell that you have just heard being struck was recovered in 1975 from the wreckage of HMAS Perth 1. On the 28th of February, HMAS Perth and the heavy cruiser USS Euston were making for the southern coast of Java. Late that evening, they encountered the Japanese Western Invasion convoy at the northern entrance of the Sunda Strait. The convoy was escorted by a large Japanese flotilla of 2 light cruisers, 8 destroyers and a mine layer, supported by another 4 cruisers, an aircraft carrier and further destroyers. Heavily outnumbered, soon running low on ammunition and changing course constantly to avoid attacks from every direction, the Australian and American crews fought desperately against impossible odds. Together, Perth and Euston succeeded in sinking a Japanese transport and a mine layer, and they severely damaged a further 3 transport ships. But under the weight of the Japanese numbers and superior firepower, the end was inevitable. Japanese ships launched 85 torpedoes during the brief engagement. Perth suffered her first hit from a Japanese shell at 11:26 p.m. Soon after midnight, the first torpedo struck. With her crew reduced to firing practice shells and illumination star shells, when a second torpedo hit Perth shortly afterwards. Her captain ordered abandon ship. Perth was hit by 2 more torpedoes before finally sinking at 25 minutes after midnight on the 1st of March. The action was all over in just under an hour from the time the first round struck. Euston, meanwhile, continued to fight, although ablaze from enemy fire. She was rent by shell and torpedo explosions and sank just 20 minutes later. The captain of both vessels perished with their ships. Of the complement of 686 men in HMAS Perth, more than half, over 350 officers and ratings, perished in this, her last action. Of the 320 survivors captured by the Japanese, 1/3 died during their long ordeal as prisoners of war. Of the more than 1,000 American officers and men in USS Euston, less than 400 escaped their sinking ship. Only 266 of them survived the harsh regime of brutality and starvation in Japanese prisoner of war camps. Australian sailors would undoubtedly wish us to remember their brave American comrades today too. Together, we remember the brave sailors of both vessels, as well as those of other Allied warships, Australian, British, American and Dutch sailors, who were lost in a series of engagements in the Java Sea while attempting to repel large Japanese invasion forces. Here this evening, we will tell the story of Captain Hector MacDonald Laws Waller, Commanding Officer of HMAS Perth 1. This evening, we're honoured to acknowledge the Australian Border Force Commissioner and his international counterparts. Captain Phil Stanford on behalf of the Chief of Navy and the Royal Australian Navy. Commodore Alison Norris, Vice President of the Australian Naval Institute. And Captain Tony DeFreitas, US Naval Attaché, US Embassy. We're also honoured to welcome Mr Peter Cook-Russell and Mr Jack Aaron of the Naval Association of Australia. Mrs Jan Chataway and Mr Peter Everly of HMAS Perth Association. Mr John King, President, ACT Branch of the Return and Services League of Australia, as well as members of the 1956 graduating class of the Royal Australian Naval College. Particularly today, we would like to welcome all current and past serving naval personnel who are in attendance this evening. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors and students on behalf of the following schools. From Victoria, Ewell Primary School, Windori, and Oxley College Primary Department, Chirnside Park. Australia's Federation Guard is a tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier within the Hall of Memory. If you're able, I invite you all to please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Rejoice, for we are young and free.
For those that are able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Captain Hector MacDonald Laws Waller. Hector Waller, commonly known as Heck, was born on the 4th of April 1900 in Benalla, Victoria, the youngest of 10 children of William and Helen Waller. He grew up in Benalla and attended Benalla Higher Elementary School. Despite growing up in a landlocked town, Waller dreamed of the sea. He entered the Royal Australian Naval College as a cadet midshipman on the 31st of December 1913 and graduated in 1917 as Chief Cadet Captain, having won the King's Medal for his gentlemanly bearing, character, good influence among his fellows, and officer-like qualities. Promoted to midshipman on New Year's Day 1918, Waller was sent to Britain, where he was posted to HMS Agincourt. At the end of the First World War, Waller was posted to HMAS Melbourne. Further promotions followed, and by 1920, he had been made sub-lieutenant. In March 1921, Waller was promoted to lieutenant, coming top of his class during examination. On the 7th of April 1923, Waller married Nancy Bowes at a Methodist church in the Sydney suburb of Lewisham. 2 sons, Michael and John, were born to the couple in the following years. Waller returned to Britain in 1924 for training as a signals officer and found that his classmate was Lord Louis Mountbatten. Waller topped the advanced course. In 1926, he returned to Australia and was placed in charge of the Signals and Wireless Telegraphy School at Flinders Naval Depot in Victoria. In 1928, Waller returned to Britain and served as a signal officer in HMS Broke. In March the following year, he was promoted to Lieutenant Commander. In 1930, Waller was posted to HMAS Australia as a squadron signals officer. By this stage, he'd earned a strong reputation for his work with communications. Over the next 2.5 years, Waller spent time in seagoing and shore postings. He was promoted to commander in 1934 and became the executive officer at the Royal Australian Naval College. He was posted to Britain again in 1936 and spent 6 months in the British Naval Intelligence Division. In December 1937, Waller was given his first command, the destroyer HMS Brazen. He initially struggled with his handling of the ship, but learned quickly. Brazen was sent to monitor the Spanish Civil War, a duty which included protecting British merchant vessels and rescuing crews of sinking ships. By mid-1939, Waller had returned to Australia and had been posted to the Navy Office as Director of Signals and Communications. At the outbreak of the Second World War, he was given command of HMAS Stuart, an obsolete destroyer, as well as having overall command of 4 more obsolete destroyers, HMAS ships Vampire, Vendetta, Voyager, and Waterhen. After arriving in the Mediterranean theatre, these vessels, known as the 19th Destroyer Division, were derisively nicknamed the Scrap Iron Flotilla by the Germans. The name was adopted as a badge of pride by the Australian sailors. Waller was recommended for accelerated promotion in March 1940 and was appointed to command the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, consisting of 4 modern British destroyers and the Scrap Iron Flotilla. The following month, he was promoted to captain. Waller's reputation continued to grow along with his successes. In July 1940, HMAS Stuart was involved in the Battle of Calabria. Waller was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his courage, enterprise, and devotion to duty. In September, Stuart attacked the Italian submarine Gondar, forcing it to surrender. And in early January 1941, Stuart provided gunfire support to Australian forces during the Battle of Bardia and assisted the Australian 6th Division during the capture of Tobruk. When Prime Minister Robert Menzies visited Egypt in February, Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, who greatly admired his Australian captain, conducted Menzies on a fleet inspection. On reaching HMAS Stuart, he remarked to Menzies, "Now you're going to meet one of the greatest captains who ever sailed the seas. His name is Waller." Stuart took part in the Battle of Cape Matapan in March. During the action, one of Stuart's torpedoes damaged the Italian cruiser Zara. Waller was awarded a bar to his DSO for this action. Waller and his command were prominent during the failed Greece and Crete operations, and in operations along the North African coast, particularly the Tobruk ferry, which brought supplies and men to the besieged fortress and ferried out wounded men. HMAS Stuart successfully completed 24 runs to Tobruk before trouble with the port engine forced the ship to return to Australia. Waller was twice mentioned in dispatches for these operations. After reaching Australia in September, Waller was given command of the light cruiser HMAS Perth. In early 1942, Perth carried out various patrols and escort duties and visited New Zealand, New Caledonia, and New Guinea. With the Japanese rapidly advancing, in February the cruiser sailed for Java in the Netherlands East Indies. At the end of the month, the Australian cruiser participated in the disastrous naval battle of the Java Sea, where 5 Allied ships were sunk by the Japanese. On the 28th of February and the 1st of March, Perth and the American heavy cruiser USS Houston fought a fierce action when they were engaged by a much larger Japanese force. Waller, never a man to admit defeat, aimed to force a passage through the enemy fleet via the Sunda Strait. After completing a turn, Perth was hit by a torpedo on the starboard side, which knocked out the forward engine room. By this stage, the ship had expended all of its main ammunition, and turret-mounted 6-inch guns were reduced to firing practice ammunition and the 4-inch guns' star shells. A second torpedo struck Perth, close to the first strike, and Waller gave the order to abandon ship. One of the Perth's survivors later wrote of the last sighting of Heck Waller, "Captain Waller was last seen with his Mae West blown up at the front of the bridge, looking down at the silent guns. Shortly afterwards, the bridge was seen to receive a shell, and Perth's captain must have been killed instantly." Several more torpedoes struck Perth, and at 12:25 on the 1st of March 1942, the cruiser slipped beneath the waves. Houston sank soon afterwards. Of Perth's crew, 353 officers, ratings, and civilians were killed or drowned. The survivors were rescued by the Japanese and spent the next 3.5 years as prisoners of war. Another 106 men from Perth died in captivity. Heck Waller was 41 years old. He was posthumously mentioned in dispatches for gallantry as resolution while serving in HMS Perth, lost by action in the Far East on the 1st of March 1942. Considered by many to have been the outstanding naval officer of his generation, a 1997 A. Collins-class submarine, HMAS Waller, was named in his honour. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, amongst almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His portrait is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Captain Hector MacDonald Laws Waller, DSO and Bar, RAN, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
I invite you all to please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They have no grave but the cruel sea, no flowers lay at their head. A rusting hulk is their tombstone, a fast on the ocean bed. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Purple Party present arms.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Purple Party elbow. Turn. Purple Party quick. Bar.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, They will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Just before we wind up, we do ask that all visitors who are part of the 1956 graduation class